So today I'm here with my step-uncle Ian. He is an Anglican minister, and we are going to talk about, in this episode, the Jubilee and the Bible and socialism. So, Ian, I'll let you introduce yourself, and you can talk about why your experience is relevant to this question.
Okay, well, my name is Ian Ritchie, and I was ordained in 2002, but before that I was professor of Christian Studies at Concord College in Winnipeg, and taught also at Queen's University and other universities along the way over the past 30 years. Also taught in Africa. But I first got interested in the biblical Jubilee year when I did my first master's thesis on the hermeneutics of John Howard Yoder, and I was very fascinated by what he brought out in his book, The Politics of Jesus, about the prescriptions of the Jubilee year and the way in which it might become relevant to the way we do economics today. And he believed that Jesus was proclaiming a kind of Jubilee year in the year 26 A.D. Now, not all scholars really followed him in saying that, going quite so far as to say that, but in fact most did not. But it did bring something provocative into the discussion because it drew people's attention to the book of Leviticus chapter 25, and how that legislation about the Jubilee year, where it said that once every 50th year, the lands were to lie fallow, and the people who had been forced because of poverty, and that's a very important concept there, that if they were forced because of poverty to sell their land, that they would be able to redeem that land, to get it back for free in the year of Jubilee after 50 years. So it was explained very clearly in Leviticus 25 that you're not actually selling the land because the land belongs to God. No one can actually buy or sell land. In fact, in that way, it's actually very similar to the concept of landholding that was held by North American First Nations people. They didn't either believe that you could buy or sell land per se.
Right, there was no property. You couldn't fence off an area and call it your own.
Yeah, and take money for allowing somebody else to do the same.
Right.
The idea
it's not yours.
Yeah. The idea that you could sort of fence off a portion of Mother Earth and sell that to somebody else was that they would have said that's like selling your mother. How can you do that?
It's absurd proposition for them.
Well, the Bible actually had a similar concept, that it's impossible to buy or sell a piece of land in perpetuity. What you're doing, it explains in Leviticus 25, is you are selling the number of crops that land will produce as a field between now and the next Jubilee year. So it explains if the years are many to the next Jubilee year, then the price is going to be very high. But if the number of years are few, then of course there are fewer crops that the person will get from farming it, and the amount that you will get for selling it will be lower in proportion to the number of years of crops. So what you're really selling is the right to sow seeds and plant and harvest for the remaining years until the next Jubilee. But in case that would lead to everlasting poverty, because in those days the land was in fact the means of production,
right.
At least for those who lived outside of walled cities. The land was the means of production.
They were all subsistence farming.
Yes, subsistence farming. So to give access to the means of production, if there was a family that had lost their land because of poverty and had to sell the number of crops to the next Jubilee year, they would be able to return to their land in the Jubilee year, and it was theirs again to farm once again.
So when they did, so if they were poor for whatever reason and they had to sell or give up their land to someone else temporarily, that person who bought it was just kind of renting it for the period.
It's like a lease situation. Yeah.
Right. So you could never really lose it. It
Yes.
was just leased.
That system actually comes into some of our modern legal systems where there are leaseback rights that are given. For example, in Nigeria, they had 50-year leases, but no non-Nigerian was allowed to buy or sell or own land. It was the government that was in charge of distribution of land, and you would basically lease it during the terms of a 50-year lease. Which is perhaps a bit similar, but it may differ in some ways.
So you don't own the land, you get the rights to use the land.
Mm-hmm.
Makes sense.
And rights are often really specified very clearly. For example, rights may include the right to farm on that land, but not necessarily to do mining underneath it. Those rights might be given to somebody else.
These were like ancient zoning laws almost. Like a city would say, this is you can build housing here, you can build factory here, you can build a whatever business here.
Now, the laws of the Jubilee also, 3 out of 4 of them were also found in the year of the Sabbath year. Once every 7th year, there was to be a year when the land was given its rest. And the land given its rest in the 7th year parallels what's in Genesis, that God rested on the 7th day of creation. Human beings are to mirror that on the every 7th day. And you can say that that's built into the very DNA of human beings, is they need to rest every once in a while. And 1 day in 7 is a pretty good pattern.
Yeah.
Because otherwise, especially if your work is hard physical manual labor, you could be forced either by a harsh employer, or you could, if you are yourself, if you're self-employed, you could be just as hard on yourself and never take a Sabbath rest and die of a heart attack by the time you're 40. So the Bible gives, I think, sound advice on how to understand the order of creation. What's built into creation from the beginning is called wisdom. And there are many passages in the Bible that speak of that the Lord created the physical universe through wisdom, with wisdom in mind as he created. And so the order and the structure that's there is a wise structure that we tamper with that structure to our own peril. If we don't understand the structure, then we're liable to tread over a line that we didn't even know existed because we didn't learn what the structure is.
And that structure applies to the land as well as our human need to rest.
Yes. Now, there were other nations as well, apart from Israel, that developed a system of letting the land lie fallow. And many farmers have developed a system for letting one patch of field lie fallow every 4 years or 5 years. Just let it go because it will recover its nutrients in that year. And it will be good for growing something different. And crop rotation is a similar idea, that certain bugs, for example, that like potatoes, will find them eventually. And you'll find if you grow, as I did, potatoes 3 years in a row, by the 3rd year, potato beetles may have found them, and you don't really get much of a crop. The idea of giving a rest means that you're short-circuiting the process by which pests will find your crops.
And so how does this play into the Jubilee? How does this fit in economically?
I think when we find, and here's when we bring it up to the present day usage, is that there have been campaigns for the elimination of worldwide debt in the part of the 40 poorest countries of the world. There was the Jubilee 2000 campaign that I was part of in the late 1990s, where for several years we were working on a program to get the debts of the 40 poorest countries in the world to get the rich nations to forgive those debts. And it was called Jubilee 2000, at least in the part of the program that was being advocated by the churches. It gained that name because of the biblical Jubilee year. And it's been pointed out by some of the critics of that movement that the unique legislation of the Jubilee year in the 50th year doesn't mean a release of debts. Well, if you're talking about the land and allowing the land to go back to its original owner in the 50th year,
yes.
Technically and strictly, it's not accurate to say that the 50th year legislation refers to the release of debts so much as it does in that one part of its legislation to the reversion of land to its original owner. So it's not really a debt release. But the thing is, the Jubilee year was also a Sabbath year or followed a Sabbath year when debts would actually have been released, because there were 3 regulations of the Sabbath year. The Sabbath year is spelled out in Deuteronomy. The land was to lie fallow in the 7th year, and debts were to be released. Now, these are cash debts, not land. So that's the second regulation of the Sabbath year.
So every 7 years, cash debts, money debts are to be released.
Yeah.
Wow. Okay. And so that combined with the Jubilee,
that, when you combine that, and because in many ways the Jubilee and the Sabbath year are closely interrelated to each other. In fact, the timing of the Sabbath year and the Jubilee year are tightly connected. The way that you know when the Sabbath year starts, when the next Sabbath year cycle starts, is from the last Jubilee year.
Okay.
The Jubilee was to begin at the end of, or near the end of 7 sevens, 49 years. So after the 49th year,
I see.
Then you have a Jubilee, 50th year.
Okay.
But it's not, the 50th year is not then part of a 7-year cycle. It's like it's a year injected into the middle, so that the old cycle ends at 49 years. That is the 50th year, and then the new cycle begins in what would be the 51st year.
Okay, so should we move on to,
Sure.
To critiques of the socialist economics of the Jubilee and whether they hold any water?
There is a critique of the way in which Jubilee is being used in recent years by Dr. Art Lindsley, who writes 5 myths about Jubilee. And I always get a little bit, my radar goes up whenever I hear 5 anything, because there seems to be this movement these days of having the 5 things you need to know about this or that or the other thing. And so, of course, he's followed this trend, and his article is called 5 Myths About Jubilee. And the first one has some merit to it, but the other 4 increasingly get sort of, I find, unsubstantiated and really are not myths that I've heard anyone hold to. So I wonder if he's just trying to fit it into what he thinks is the most persuasive way of reasoning these days.
One reason wouldn't have been good enough for an article.
Yes. But his first reason is myth number 1, that Jubilee meant a forgiveness of debt. Lindsay claims the Jubilee year of Leviticus 25 does not spell out a forgiveness of debt. But strictly speaking, it's not really true that biblical scholars ever actually said that the Jubilee year itself required forgiveness of debt. Rather, that was one of the 3 laws of the Sabbath year, which is spelled out in both Leviticus 25 and in Deuteronomy 15. The Sabbath year, as its name suggests, was supposed to happen every 7th year. If the Jubilee year happened in the 50th year, then the release or forgiveness of debt was already over in the previous year. And it was very unlikely that any new debts would be acquired in the short space of time between the 49th and the 50th years.
Right.
Especially if people knew that they're going to have to release them a few months later anyhow.
So this was a straw man argument.
Yeah, it's basically a straw man argument. So while it's technically correct to say that the Jubilee did not pertain to monetary debt forgiveness, the Five Myths document omits the fact that the Sabbath year regulations had already taken care of that.
And it's not what the scholars are actually
talking about. And there's no actual scholars are claiming. Now, he might have gotten the idea from the fact that the Jubilee 2000 campaign was called that. It was called Jubilee 2000. It was about the forgiveness of monetary debt. So maybe that's what he's... Although he doesn't actually spell that out either. He leaves that to our imagination. And I don't know why he leaves that to our imagination, but I think it's because the tone of the article wants to get us to dismiss all of what all those people say about Jubilee. Mm. But he doesn't want to have to prove each thing that he's saying in regard to all of what they say about Jubilee.
Of course not.
Yeah. So
no citations here for his...
There aren't, because he didn't make any citations in his article to any specific people who hold these views. One of the scholars that he does refer to on his side is Ron Sider, who wrote a book called Rich Christians in an Age of Hunger, and who does mention about the biblical Jubilee laws. But he quotes Ron Sider as saying things that are on his side of the debate. But of course, Ron Sider, if he were present, would never want to assert any of the things that that Mr. Lindsley is saying, at least in regard to the Sabbath year and debt release and Jubilee. So basically, all he ends up saying is that Ron Sider was careful enough to not fall into the trap that I'm saying all those other guys fell into. But if you don't name those other guys, then of course you get the feeling that a straw man is being attacked here. He could probably put a disclaimer at the end of his movie saying no real people were harmed in the making of this documentary.
Right.
And he could put under that in brackets, only straw men. His myth number 2 was that Jubilee involves a redistribution of wealth, which was the land. Now, it's true that the biblical record does not use an equivalent of the modern English word redistribution, and Lindsley is correct in pointing that out. But the main point that was being made by the scholars that I learned from is more that perpetual access to the means of production was being guaranteed in the Jubilee year law, being guaranteed to the people who farmed the land, people who had land allotted to them at the original conquest of Canaan by Israel. And since those in those days, for farmers, the land was the means of production, not necessarily for everyone else. For people who lived in walled cities, for them, the labor of their hands as skilled artisans, craftsmen, would be the means of production for them. And then you can get into discussion of the alienation of labor and so on. But the Jubilee law doesn't go into that. It goes into the extra parts of the legislation that are unique only to the Jubilee legislation, pertains really only to land outside of walled cities. And Lindsley makes that clear, but once again, the scholars that I was in connection with in regard to the Jubilee teaching never said otherwise.
Of course.
They pointed out that this, yes, there are limitations on this, but they are meant to guarantee access to the means of production for those who use the labor of their hands to farm the land. So again, he doesn't cite chapter and verse, so I have to assume that he's referring to somebody that I don't know who he's referring to. And so this myth, again, I think falls into a problem. And I think he's once again knocking down a straw man. His myth number 3 is that Jubilee shows the relative nature, the relativization of private property. He thinks that's a myth. Lindsley makes the bold claim. He says the way that this myth is argued is that since God owns the land, Leviticus 25, verse 23, there are no absolute rights to private property. Therefore, this provides warrant for government to take private property, land or wealth, and redistribute it. So I think he's missing the ball completely here.
Kind of, confusing terms and ideas.
For one thing, it's clear that all the scholars do point to the fact that it says God owns the land. But then when he jumps off of that to say, therefore this provides warrant for government to take private property.
That sounds more like something a modern libertarian American right-winger would say than a biblical scholar or somebody who lived in Jesus' time.
Yeah, in fact, biblical scholars, those who spend all their time researching what the Scriptures said, would say that it's not even their job to make comment on how this could be applied in the modern context. They will point out how different our society is from theirs, and say this makes it problematic and difficult to make the translation, as it were, into modern culture. It's the job of systematic theologians to make more recommendations about how we should understand all of this for today's context, and what should we do today. But Mr. Lindsley does not quote either systematic theologians or biblical theologians who actually say this.
No, just Republican talking points so far.
But even amongst Republicans, there's actually differences of opinion in regard to whether government should have the right to expropriate land or not.
Right.
I recall in the lead up to Donald Trump's nomination, there were some libertarians who were saying, we don't trust this guy. He's not a real Republican because his record in the past is he believes that he can expropriate land and use local municipal governments to expropriate land for his golf courses in Scotland.
Yes.
And in fact, the leader of the Scottish referendum on Scottish independence got himself into hot water precisely because of that. After the referendum was over, it was discovered Salmond had influenced a city council to accept Donald Trump's expropriation and basically give the land to him, which had belonged to other people. So how this all works out in today's world, in today's politics, it's another whole ball of wax, as they say. Private property, it's God who owns the land. Private property, if you think in terms of eternity, the question of land ownership in perpetuity becomes problematic, I think. But probably a better story from the Old Testament to draw this out, if Mr. Lindsley had thought to use this story, would be to look at the story of Naboth's vineyard in the Old Testament. The Old Testament's view of land expropriation by governments, which in those days, of course, would have been kings and queens, would be better shown in the case of King Ahab's covetous desire for Naboth's vineyard. That was the most notorious case in the entire Old Testament of land theft by the rich and powerful. And it became the prime example of how social injustice was fueled by pagan idolatry and greed. All the prophets after Elijah's time, and it was Elijah who called them to account, Elijah said that this would lead to the destruction of the northern kingdom of Israel not long after, if they continued to pursue this sort of way of living. And the story, of course, was that the king of Israel, King Ahab, had seen this beautiful vineyard just sort of downstairs from his palace. but it belonged to this Israelite named Naboth. And he started to covet that vineyard so much he wanted it. So King Ahab asked for Naboth's vineyard, and he said, I'll give you a better vineyard somewhere else, but I would like to have this one because I want to plant a vegetable garden. And immediately Naboth refused, saying, may God forbid that I should sell you the inheritance that God had given to my ancestors. It's not even allowed under our law. And King Ahab, we read in the Bible, went home and sulked. He threw himself on the bed and whined and complained. And his wife Jezebel came to him and said, why are you so sad? And he said, because Naboth denied me his vineyard. And Jezebel, basically, to make a long story short, arranges for Naboth to be killed and the vineyard to be taken over by Ahab. Now, Jezebel, who was not an Israelite, of course, did not know Israel's law or care. So she, being a pagan who believed that, sure, you can buy and sell anyone's land, and more especially if you're the king. So to her, Israelites' law meant nothing. But to King Ahab, well, he was an Israelite. It's the idea in the Bible is that Ahab should have known better, but he allows this to take place. And he covets this land, which he knows has been given under the law to Naboth's ancestors. Now, this is kind of the prime example of social injustice in the whole Old Testament. Everything leads up to that, and the eventual deportation of the northern 10 tribes of Israel into Assyria is attributed to this type of injustice happening over and over again. And so, again, the land lies fallow.
Right.
During the Assyrian deportation. And we're even told at one point that the Assyrians get concerned that where the northern 10 tribes of Israel had been living was turning into the haunt of wild animals because there was nobody there who knew how to farm that land. And eventually there is an order from one of the Assyrian kings to send a few people back who know how to farm the land, because otherwise it's no good to anybody.
Yeah, right.
And nobody profits from it. So it's kind of a way of saying that what goes around comes around.
Well, it sounds like the story has something to say about whether you can call something that really is the purview of the commons or God your own, and take it and sell it and trade it as you wish.
Yeah, and that, of course, became a huge issue at the time of the precursors to the Industrial Revolution in England, when they started fencing off land that had been common land that anybody could pasture their flocks on.
The enclosures.
Enclosure movement. And that created great social upheavals in England with repercussions that lasted centuries and in a sense are still there today.
It was kind of the necessary precursor to capitalism.
Yeah.
Or one of them.
So myth number 4, if we want to move on to that, was that that Lindsley talks about is the idea that Jubilee leads to income equality. And we can dispense with this one fairly quickly, because once again, I have never read any biblical or theological scholars who have actually made this claim, that it would lead to income equality. So I really don't know what Lindsley's been smoking here. There's one footnote, number 19, to Derek Tidball, but Tidball is not actually quoted there as saying the word equality, only that it puts brakes on the acquisition of wealth by the rich and the gap between rich and poor. There's a force in society that causes the rich to get richer, or that, how can we put it? It's forces that make it successively easier and easier for the rich to get richer and richer, and for the poor to get poorer and poorer.
Right.
Things do not just remain neutral.
Right. Once you have money, getting more of it becomes exponentially easier.
And in fact, you can, if you're not good at number crunching yourself, you can hire somebody to do the number crunching for you to find out which stocks would be the best ones to invest in.
Right, which you could not do if you were poor.
Yeah.
So this is another straw man.
Yeah, it's another straw man. It's the idea that forces that make the rich get richer and the poor get poorer, that there should be some checks and balances, some brakes on that.
Yeah.
To say that is to say something very different from saying that it will lead to income equality, economic equality. I don't think anyone imagines, I can't think of the name of anyone who actually says we would get actual complete equality in terms of income.
So it sounds to me then that what this author is doing and what his organization is doing is kind of importing or imputing upon the Bible and the Jubilee modern Republican and pro-capitalist talking points, mm-hmm. where when they really have no business.
Yeah, he's setting up straw man arguments so that he can knock them down more easily.
For a purpose, it sounds like.
Yes. Yeah, he's not just doing it to make himself look smarter, although that might be an added benefit of it, but as long as he can prove it. But it is definitely trying to point us in a direction of a particular economic system, which he feels is under attack by some of the teaching on Jubilee.
Right. He's delegitimizing any solutions that might threaten the power of private property and capital.
And then is myth number 5, that Jubilee is a universally applicable principle, that it applies to all people. Once again, the biblical scholars that I've grown up with, who pointed us to Jubilee in the first place, already pointed out that to apply the biblical Jubilee's return of land would be extremely difficult to do today. Because for one thing, we don't have the original allocation of land plots to Israel are not known today. And it was applicable only to those who lived outside of walled cities. But today, of course, in Canada, we don't have walled cities. The idea that the Jubilee is universally applicable principle that applies to all people, I haven't read any biblical scholars, and I don't think Lindsley has either, who actually say that in so many words. In fact, they were more careful than Lindsley in drawing conclusions about what we can say about biblical Jubilee. So I think for that reason, I would conclude that he's knocking down a lot of straw man arguments.
He seems to have just a hoard of straw in his house or his barn.
Yeah, he's got a big stash of straw.
So what does the Jubilee and the Bible, in Leviticus and in these rules, what do these rules teach us about how economics should be handled, and what can they tell us about what to do today?
I think the principles of Sabbath year point us towards something that will put the brakes on that force in society that makes the rich get richer and the poor get poorer, if we understand it in the way that the original biblical authors intended us to understand it. For example, redemption of debt was provided for. And there is an encouragement in the Scripture to, when you know that the Sabbath year is coming, we are commanded to be generous towards those who are in need and lend expecting nothing in return. And Jesus says that. He spells it out even more clearly than it is in the Old Testament, that we are to give expecting nothing in return. That is to say, don't take interest on a loan, because interest in particular, especially if you're loaning to the poor, will bite. In fact, that's the literal translation of the word for interest in Hebrew, that it's a bite. It's a bite into the person's body, in a sense, because their ability to pay you back is going to be bitten into by taking interest. So if you ever want to get paid back, the idea would be to charge as little interest as possible, rather than charging the most. And so then really it's a warning against greed. And the Bible in the Old Testament is very clear to say, if you see the Sabbath year approaching, that it will be soon, you shall continue to be generous and trust that God will provide, even though you know that the year of redemption is coming close. Even if you think there might not be a chance this person will actually pay back the debt before it's going to be forgiven anyways. If you see that the person is in need, that they really are poor and in need, you should be generous anyways.
So a lesson from this would be that the type of loans given to places like Greece and Central America are not helpful because their interest levels are too high.
Yes.
And they do more harm than good, and they actually hurt the ability for those countries to pay back the money that they had borrowed in the first place.
Certainly the concept of allowing the land rest, allowing a fallow period is very important ecologically. And once again, we are warned to put the brakes on greed. There should be enough motive just from seeing your crops do well to put the effort into it and then take a rest once every 7th year. The idea then is that there's a structure built into creation that we need to respect. And if we don't, then we're going to make life much more difficult for ourselves as a result. But if the time of that is delayed, we tend to think as human beings in the present moment. And if we think about short-term rewards, short-term gain, then we're setting ourselves up for disaster. I think these are important principles, and the whole idea of interest, of course. If we go outside of the biblical Jubilee year and the Sabbath years, interest was not to be taken on loans against fellow Israelites. And the idea is there that in too many cases, taking of interest on loans would be destructive and would lead to poverty. It doesn't quite say that it would be impossible ever for any situation to ever arise where taking of interest on a loan might not be beneficial to everyone. The idea is that if there is a situation that could arise where some people will be losers and others will be winners, you want to protect those people who will likely to be losers from losing just because the more powerful person has more power.
Right. And if they do lose, that they should be given a chance to recuperate what they have lost.
Yes.
So, in that sense, the Jubilee and these old laws, they're not, in the Marxist sense, necessarily dismantling class structure, classes, but they are kind of, it's almost maybe a social democratic approach where they are putting specific and tough barriers in terms of how much of a wealth gap and a power gap can be will be allowable.
Yes, and some of it, of course, would, certainly in the Old Testament, have to be carried out through government structures, because kings are advised to adhere to wisdom in ruling the people, and to not give in to the temptation towards greed. And over and over again in the book of Proverbs, the instructions to kings are very careful about that, to learn how to govern the people wisely, so that they don't so that they are not ground under by those who would take advantage of them, and that would be the entrepreneurial class in many cases. In some cases, of course, Samuel warns that in wanting to have a king, this was before Israel had kings. They had only judges in those days. Samuel warns the people about their desire for a king, that the king will come and oppress you. He will take your sons and your daughters and make them into his wives and concubines, and he will take them, your daughters, and use them as perfumers, and your sons, and turn them into his stone cutters, and so on. So he warns them that it's not going to be all a bed of roses if they desire to have a king, but they still wanted a king.
So it is a bit of a critique of ruling class or the upper class, but not really a call to abolish it altogether, just to make it as benevolent as possible.
Yes.
So there you have it, comrades. If we were to associate a political perspective with the Old Testament, it looks like it would be social democrats. The Bible is moderately radical when it comes to property rights, and the monopolization of land. It doesn't have a lot to say about class struggle, but it does have a lot to say about wealth and poverty and economics, and the moral imperative to keep the wealth gap as minimized as possible. On the next episode, we'll talk about what Jesus has to say about wealth and economics and how that relates to socialism. So, thumbs up if you like the video. Thumbs down if you think the Bible's top concern is abortion and homosexuality.